Lesson 65. Personal pronouns, indefinite pronouns, review of pronouns. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 193 of the textbook, and as you may have noticed from the title, the focus of today's lesson is pronouns. Throughout most of this textbook, the pronouns and verbs that you have seen have been third person. We really have not seen much in the way of first person or second person speech. People referring to themselves, people talking to someone. It's mostly just been third person. But in this lesson, that changes a bit because we're going to be talking more about the first person pronouns like ego and tu, which is the second person pronoun. So let's take a look at section 507. It says personal pronouns. The personal pronouns are ego, which means I, of the first person, and tu, which means thou or you. Of course, thou is archaic, of the second person. For the third person, as already learned, the demonstratives or the reflexive sui are used. So as they say here, third-person pronouns in Latin have already been covered pretty thoroughly. We've talked about, as they say here, demonstratives. If you want to say that man or that woman, or he, she, or it, you have several pronouns available to you. You could say hic, haec, hoc. Hic by itself could mean this guy. Haec by itself could mean this woman. Hoc could mean this thing. Same with ille, which means that. So ille, illa, illud. Ille by itself could be that guy. Illa by itself could be that woman. Also, there's is, id. And keep in mind that those demonstratives that I just mentioned can function as demonstrative pronouns or as demonstrative adjectives. They can work by themselves, or they can work with a noun paired with them. So those demonstratives, so to speak, do double duty. They can be adjectives or pronouns. They're flexible in that respect. In this particular lesson, we're going to be talking mainly about just pronouns, words that have substance to them and can stand in for a noun, but they don't function as adjectives. They're just pronouns. In section 507, we're talking about ego and tu, and not only that, we want to look at their plural forms too. And those are located in the appendix in section 18, which we're going to look at in a moment. But before we do, I'd like to take a quick look at section 508. If we're learning about ego and tu, then what do we do with those? Well, section 508 tells us a little bit about that. It says the use of ego and tu. The nominatives ego, tu, nos, and vos are seldom used except for emphasis. So let's talk about pronouns for a second. There's a really great book called The Latin Language by a guy named L.R. Palmer. It's from 1954, and it's published these days, as far as I know, by the University of Oklahoma Press. And chapter 4 of this book is all about spoken Latin. In fact, the title of that chapter is Spoken Latin, Plautus and Terence. And he talks about spoken Latin in that context of those plays, because within the plays you have lots of dialogue, people talking to each other. So here in section 508 in this textbook, it says the nominatives ego, tu, nos, and vos are seldom used except for emphasis. Notice they don't mention other cases like genitive, dative, accusative. They're talking about the nominatives there. But they are mentioning frequency, that is, how frequently they are used. So here's a quote from L.R. Palmer in his book, The Latin Language, on page 75. He says, colloquial speech makes much freer use of the personal and demonstrative pronouns than does written Latin. And he gives lots of examples of sentences from Plautus and Terence, where there's lots of dialogue with lots of pronouns, like ile, illam, mihi, ise id, tu. And then he says, such redundancy of expression, the product of the speaker's anxiety to hammer his point home, is particularly frequent in superlatives. So then he talks about redundancy and sort of overstating things, stating things with a strong way of saying something, with double comparatives and doubling up, having a pronoun in the verb itself, plus you add in another pronoun for extra emphasis and clarity. Also, double negatives you can find in Plautus and Terence. So what's my point here? What am I saying? I'm saying that in Latin that is recording speech, such as the plays of Plautus and Terence, you'll get lots more of pronouns being used just in normal speech. Why? Because it's dialogue. People are talking to each other. They're often trying to emphasize things to each other or speak strongly to each other. Whereas here in Caesar's Gallic Wars, it's just largely third-person narratives about past events. So the style and genre of the literature you're reading is going to affect how much of this you see. And again, as I've said many times, if you speak Latin for practice, you'll get to use all these different pronouns in lots of different ways, and you'll get lots of practice using them, and you'll learn them faster. So let's go to the appendix, that is section 18 of the appendix, and let's talk through some of these pronouns that we see here in lesson 65. Section 18 of the appendix is on page 257 in the back of the book. It's at the bottom of the page. So let's talk a bit about these pronouns. Again, these are just pronouns. They are not words that double as pronouns and adjectives. So in the first person, we have ego, which means I, and that's nominative. So if I want to say a first-person singular verb, like laudo, I could say laudo, and that means I praise all by itself. The verb laudo does not need the help of any pronoun in order to express the idea of I praise or I am praising. The pronoun I is included in the verb laudo. So if I say ego laudo, if I put the verb laudo but ego along with it, it's really redundant. I'm just duplicating what's already in the verb. So why would I want to do that? Well, for clarity, for emphasis. Oftentimes in Latin, the verb is at the end of the sentence. What if I want to tell someone right up front who is doing the action? I could put a pronoun at the front of the sentence. That way they don't have to wait until the end to see who's doing the action. In fact, I see a sentence like that here in L.R. Palmer's book. It says, tu autem quae pro capite argentum mihi jamque semper, and then we get the verb numeras. So he's saying you count, but the verb is at the end of the clause, but he puts the first word of the clause as tu. So that's an actual example from Latin literature. What if I want to say that I am doing something and emphasize that I'm doing it and not someone else? I could say laudo, or I could say ego laudo, I praise. Not that guy over there. He's not doing the praising. Not those people over there. Not that lady over there, but I praise. Ego laudo. So you can use pronouns in Latin for clarity, for emphasis, to indicate who is doing the action before you get to the verb, as I showed you in that literary example. So there are several reasons why you might want to use pronouns in Latin. So ego is nominative. You can add that in with a verb if you want. Let's skip over mei for a moment and look at mihi. Mihi means to me or for me. It's dative. If you want to say someone's giving a book to me, you could put mihi. Or someone's doing something for me. Or it could be working with a verb that takes the dative, such as persuadeo. If you want to say someone's persuading me, you would use mihi because persuadio takes the dative. In the accusative, we have me, which is also ablative. So if you want to say that someone sees me, well, it's the same in English as in Latin. It's me, right? So they see me. In Latin, the word for me would be me. Also, ablative, me, you could have it as the object of a preposition. You could say, me, by me. For example, if there's a passive verb, you could say, the action is being done, me, by me. So an ablative of agent. So we have lots and lots of uses for nominative, dative, accusative, and ablative. Genitive is a different story. We don't really have lots of ways to use mei in Latin. You really don't see it much at all. Mei technically would be translated as of me. Now, in ancient Greek, they use the pronoun that means of me. They use that a lot to show possession. For example, in Latin, if you have a horse, that's the word equus. So if you want to say my horse, if we were going to use Greek syntax, we could use mei. We could say equus mei, the horse of me, in the sense of my horse. But that's really not how we do it in Latin. In Latin, we would just use the adjective meus mea meum. Meus mea meum is a first and second declension adjective. And so you would just make the adjective agree with whatever the noun is. So equus is masculine. So you would just put meus with it. And so equus meus, my horse. If it's feminine, my table would be mensa mea. Something neuter, such as a cup, poculum, would be poculum meum, my cup. So the way we show possession like that is with meus mea meum. In ancient Greek, they have a pronoun just like mei. It's the genitive of ego. It's really the word mu, M-O-U. It means of me. So let's talk about plurals now, the plural forms of the first person pronoun. So nos would be the plural form of ego. That translates into English as we. Notice that nos is also accusative. So if you see the word nos in Latin, it really could be nominative or accusative. You don't know which until you look at the context. Of course, if it's accusative, that translates into English as us. We and us in English are nominative and accusative. And then dative plural and ablative plural are the same. That's nobis. So nobis would mean to us in the dative. Nobis in the ablative could mean, if you have an ablative of agent, you could say a nobis. The activity is being done by us. In the genitive, nostrum is plural, and you could see that used in the context of a partitive genitive, or genitive of the whole. If you want to say something like, one of us will go to the store. In Latin, you would use the partitive genitive nostrum for that, one of us. Again, these are just pronouns. Don't confuse these with the adjective noster, nostra, nostrum, which means our, O-U-R. Moving on to second person pronouns, we have tu in the nominative singular. This comes into Spanish and French almost directly. Tui is the genitive singular form, which we don't use much at all. And you may see it occasionally in certain constructions, but it's really not common. But tibi, te, and te, you'll see all the time. Tibi means to you or for you. It could be an indirect object. It could be working with a verb that takes the dative, such as persuadeo. If the word you is the direct object in a sentence, such as I see you, then the direct object would be te. If you want to say an ablative of agent, that activity is being done by you, you could say a te. In the plural, we have vos for nominative and also accusative. Notice that vos is nominative and accusative, just like nos. So you have to use the context of the sentence to really see what that word is doing. And then vobis is dative plural and ablative plural, just like nobis. So vobis in the dative could be an indirect object. I am giving the food to y'all. In Latin, that would be vobis. The activity is being performed by y'all. An ablative of agent could be a vobis. And then if I want to have a partitive genitive, I could use vestrum and say, one of y'all will go to the store. So I could use vestrum there to say of y'all. And then finally, over on the right, we have reflexive pronouns. These are pronouns that refer back to the subject of the sentence. We've seen these in indirect speech quite a bit. For example, in Caesar's Gallic Wars, it can say things like, he says that he will blah, blah, blah. Or Caesar says that he will blah, blah, blah. In a sentence like that, say in the accusative is the subject accusative of the indirect speech. Keep in mind that we don't really have singular and plural here of this. It's the same form for both. Sibi is singular and plural, say, and the alternate form say. The form say does not imply plurality. It's just the same as say. We don't have a nominative for this because if you want to say he himself, she herself, things like that in Latin, you would use the intensive pronoun ipse. So ipse, in my mind, is really what you would use for nominatives. We saw the dative form sibi when Orgetorix was putting together a delegation. It said he was putting together a delegation sibi for himself. So we've actually seen these reflexive pronouns quite a bit. Okay, let's go back to the lesson. Let's go back to page 193. So we've covered 507 and 508. Again, in 508, we see nostrum and vestrum are used only after words implying a part. We talked about the partitive genitive. One of us will go to the store. One of you will go to the store. Sentences like that. Again, that's a partitive genitive, which we've discussed many times. Let's move on to section 509 and talk about indefinite pronouns. What is an indefinite pronoun? Well, they tell us here, indefinite pronouns are so called because they do not refer to any definite person or thing. And in English, what this means is words like something or anything. If I say to someone, I don't care what you do, just do something. That's very indefinite. I'm just telling that person to do some undefined thing. So in that sense, the word something is indefinite. So these pronouns, such as something or anything, they're indefinite because they don't really refer to anything specific. And so we have those in Latin as well as English. The main pronoun that I think of when I think of Latin indefinite pronouns is number 2, aliquis. Okay, so that's just quis, the interrogative pronoun, but with ali attached to the front. I'm not sure of the etymology here. I think the etymology of ali is related to alias, alia, alium, which means other. I don't know that for sure. I'm just speculating. But anyway, the ali at the beginning of the word designates indefiniteness. And so aliquis could mean someone or anyone, because quis is masculine or feminine and therefore could refer to a person. Aliquid would be the neuter form of this. So that could mean something or anything. You may be wondering why they have quis as the first one here, listed as number 1. Quis can be indefinite after certain words. And those words are si, nisi, num, and ne. When you see quis after those words, it can mean exactly the same thing as number 2, aliquis. So if you're reading Latin literature and you see something like this, si quis, what that really means is si aliquis, if anybody or if somebody. Or nisi quis, that means unless someone or unless somebody. And so there's a mnemonic you can use to remember that. there's a little chant or a little saying you can say, after si, nisi, num, and ne, all the allies fly away. So the ALI at the beginning of aliquis, if you put aliquis right after si, nisi, num, or ne, the ali goes away and it just becomes quis. So si aliquis becomes si quis, nisi aliquis becomes nisi quis, and so on and so forth. So quick review, aliquis and aliquid means someone or anyone or something and anything. After si, nisi, num, and ne, the ali goes away and it can be just quis. That's why they list quis as an indefinite. Let's quickly talk through some more of these indefinites. Number 3, quispiam. I personally have not seen that one very much in texts. Apparently it means anyone, in the sense of anyone at all. Another ending you'll see, as in number 4, is quam. That's one of those things you can tag onto a word that gives it, at times, an indefinite flavor. So quisquam can also be an indefinite. Numbers 5 and 6 are very similar because they both have the same literal meaning. In number 5, qui plus libet. And libet is an impersonal that means it pleases. So the idea with number 5, qui libet, is something like whatever pleases. In English, we might say whatever you please. So the idea of whatever pleases you, that idea carries with it an indefinite kind of feeling because it's open-ended. And same with number 6, qui vis. Again, qui is the pronoun, and then vis is the second person singular form of wolo. Wolo, vis, walt. I want, you want, he, she, or it wants. So qui vis literally is what you want, in the sense of whatever you want. So again, that's open-ended with an indefinite kind of feeling to it. In number 7, you have que attached to the pronoun quis, quisque, which can mean each. And we've seen that particular word in our Caesar reading. I believe we saw it when it was saying that the leaders of the Helvetii asked that each person have some flour or some barley meal. I believe they used the word quisque there, with the meaning of each one needs to have some food with them. Number 8 is interesting. With quidam, we're just taking qui, quae, quod, and we're adding on dam as the ending. So quidam is masculine. It would mean a certain guy. If it were quaedam, quaedam, that would be for a woman. So that would be a certain woman or a certain lady. Quodam would be a certain inanimate object. Another ending that you'll see frequently that gives words an indefinite feeling is cumque. That's a C-U-M-Q-U-E, cumque. You can add it onto words like, for example, quando means when. But if you add cumque, it becomes quando cumque, which means whenever. And then the word ubi means where. But if you add cumque, it becomes ubi cumque, and it becomes wherever. So that's another quick example of an indefinite kind of ending. And one last thing before we move on to 510. The word quid, which means what, can be doubled up. And if you just have two of them put together into one word, you just get quid. And that can be indefinite. That can mean whatever. So we have lots of different indefinites in Latin. Indefinite pronouns, indefinite adverbs, I suppose, like quod cumque, quando cumque, ubi cumque. And as I always say, if you speak Latin, it gives you a chance to try out some of these things in conversation and get used to them much more quickly than merely just waiting to see them in some text somewhere. It allows you to sort of jump into this kind of material and swim around in it a bit and get used to it, experiment with it, try it out. Spoken Latin is like a laboratory. It's like a practice laboratory where you just get to practice the language and get an affinity for and a familiarity with the language. Let's talk about some spelling variations in section 510, variations in the way these words are declined. It says in 510, quis as a pronoun is declined like the interrogative quis, and as an adjective like the relative qui. So again, we have the concept of these kinds of pronouns functioning independently as pronouns or paired up with a noun functioning as an adjective. They say only the pronominal part of the compounds is declined. What does pronominal mean? In Latin, the word nomen means name. We have lots of English words related to it, like nominate. If you nominate someone for an award, you name them for an award. Also, we have words like nomenclature, which means a system of naming things. So nomen means name in Latin. In the realm of Latin grammar, nomen also is a grammatical term that means something sort of like a noun, but not exactly. For the ancient Romans, the word nomen included not only nouns, but also adjectives. It's kind of strange. Well, strange to us at least, not to them. There's a grammatical work you can read called the Ars Minor by an ancient grammarian named Donatus. That's Donatus. Donatus and his Ars Minor is a brief overview of Latin grammar. And in this work, he talks about the various parts of speech. And one of the parts of speech that he discusses is called nomen. And under the heading of nomen, which means name, he lists both what we would refer to as nouns and what we would refer to as adjectives. Why would Donatus classify adjectives under the heading of nomen? The reason is that because for the ancient Roman, adjectives were used substantively so much that they had a nounish quality to them. We've talked about substantive adjectives. For example, if I say, only the strong survive. If I say, only the strong survive, I've used an adjective as a noun. The word strong is an adjective. So that's called using an adjective as a substantive adjective. So the word strong there is substantive in the sense that it is talking about a physical being, strong people, strong animals, strong somebody. If I say there's a dangerous trap up ahead and only the wise will avoid it, again, I'm using an adjective, wise, as a noun. That's called a substantive. What we do in English when we use an adjective in a substantive kind of way, for us, it's not all that common, but for the ancient Romans, it was extremely common. You could just say an adjective and not put a noun with it, and it would just be a substantive. So for the ancient Romans, there was less of a boundary line between adjectives and nouns than what we picture today. That's why in the Ars Minor, Donatus classifies both adjectives and nouns under the heading of nomen. So the word nomen, in its grammatical use in Latin, does not exactly map onto our English word noun. Our English word noun is a distant descendant of the Latin word nomen. It comes through Norman French and then into Middle English. So it goes through some changes. But our word noun does ultimately come from nomen. But we have a more narrow use of what a noun is than the Romans did. All that stuff I just said is a long-winded way to explain the word pronominal. The preposition pro means in place of or instead of, and then nomen, N-O-M-I-N, that's the genitive stem of the third declension noun nomen. So it means in place of a noun and therefore related to a pronoun. So pronominal means pronoun related. In English, we have pronoun in place of a noun. In Latin, they have pronomen in place of a noun using the Latin word nomen. So when they say only the pronominal part of the compound is declined, what that means is just the pronoun part is declined. The different endings that we've talked about, like dom in number 8 above, wis in number 6, libet, quam in number 4, all those suffixes, they do not decline. It's just the part of the word that is the pronoun. And I gave you an example, number 8, quidam. To make it feminine, it becomes quidam. The dam part stays the same, just the pronoun part, what they term here as the pronominal part, that's the part that changes or declines. So quidam, quidam, quodam, that's how it works. Just the pronoun part changes, the ending stays the same. That having been said, we do have some spelling changes that occur. For aliquis, that's masculine. If you want to make it feminine, it does not become aliquai, as you might expect. That's irregular. It becomes aliqua. And especially with quidam, you have some big spelling changes. In Latin, when one letter comes before another letter, you get linguistic changes that help those two letters blend together better. And so with words like quimdam, if you want to have quimdam in the accusative, that M turns into an N and becomes quindam. Why? Because it's much easier to say. Quimdam is awkward because you're putting your two lips together to say the M sound. Then you have to fully release your lips to make a D sound. But with the letter N, you don't have to put your lips together. Your lips can stay apart, and they're ready to say the letter D right after that. So quindam is much easier to say than quimdam. You can try it yourself and see the difference. So the basic idea there is that before the letter D, the letter M turns into the letter N. So you get quandam, quorundam, things like that. For quisquam, in the neuter, you might expect quidquam, but the D there turns into a C and you get quiquam. So that's another spelling change to be aware of. And I would encourage you to study some of these paradigms on your own. You know, Wiktionary is the dictionary arm of Wikipedia, and it's really a wonderful website, wiktionary.org. They've got paradigms of all these different Latin words, so you can sit there at your computer or on your phone and look over these different paradigms and see the spelling patterns. And, you know, just a few minutes a day of studying through those patterns, and it'll help you to see how the pattern works. So, as a student of Latin, you know, you might want to devote some time to getting familiar with these different patterns. It's just a matter of familiarization. And as I always say, once you get the basic gist of the spelling patterns, you can then start to use them in conversation if you have opportunities to speak Latin. And again, if you do that, it will speed you on your way as you attempt to learn this language. Let's move on to 511, and we have basically a big review here. We have a review of the different kinds or classes of pronouns. I would point out that these are not just pronouns, they're also adjectives. In number 1, they really are just pronouns. Ego, tu, and sui, those are just strictly pronouns. For ego, we have ego, mei, mihi, me, and me. For tu, we have tu, tui, tibi, te, and te. For sui, that's not the adjective sua, sua, suum. That's the genitive form of the reflexive pronoun. So sui is genitive, sibi, dative, both singular and plural. Se or se is accusative, and then se, again, is ablative. So those are strictly pronouns. The plural of ego is nos. The plural of tu is vos, V-O-S. Those two plural pronouns have dative plurals and ablative plurals, such as nobis and vobis. So those are all just pronouns. But in number 2, they don't mention the fact that these are, in fact, first and second declension adjectives, not pronouns. I guess if you used them substantively, you could sell them as pronouns, but at bare minimum, they are words that function as adjectives and can be used substantively as a substantive adjective. So meos, mea, meum is a first and second declension adjective. That means my. Tuus, tua, tuum is a first and second declension adjective that means your, in the singular, that is. Suus, sua, suum means his, her, its, or their, referring to the subject. Saying that something belongs to the subject. If you want to say his, her, its, or their, referring to someone other than the subject, you use the genitive demonstrative eus. Noster and wester are both first and second declension adjectives that mean our, and y'all's. Wester is plural, meaning something that belongs to more than one person. Number 3, demonstratives. These, again, can be pronouns or adjectives. You can have them standing alone or paired up with a noun. So hic means this. It's masculine, nominative, singular. So it could stand by itself and just mean this guy. Haec, H-A-E-C, would be feminine. It could stand alone and just mean, haec, this woman or this lady. Or you could pair them up with a noun, and now they become adjectives. Hic vir, this man. Haec femina, this woman. Iste in textbooks is often portrayed as a second-person demonstrative. Okay, hic means this, ile means that. Iste is somewhere in between. Sometimes you'll see it translated as that thing of yours, to give it a kind of second-person flavor, to associate it with the person being spoken to. If I say, iste canis, it means that dog of yours. And so for this reason, it is sometimes described in textbooks as having a pejorative kind of flavor to it. If I say to my neighbor, take that dog of yours and get out of here. If I say something like that to my neighbor, it sounds kind of rude. Referring to the dog as that dog of yours, that's kind of what iste does in Latin. It's a second-person demonstrative associated with the person being spoken to. And so it can have a pejorative or insulting kind of connotation to it. Moving along to ile. Ile means that. So ile is masculine, nominative singular. So if you have it in a sentence, ile, it could just mean that guy. Illa is feminine. It could mean that lady. So in that way, you can have it standing alone, and it functions as a pronoun, a demonstrative pronoun. Or you can pair it up with a noun, and now it becomes an adjective because it's modifying a noun. Ile vir, that guy, that man. Illa femina, illa mulier, that woman, that lady. So these can be demonstrative pronouns or demonstrative adjectives. Is, ea, id, we've talked about that many times. It can mean this, it can mean that, it can mean he, she, it, or if it doesn't have a very strong demonstrative force, it can just mean the. And we've seen a couple of times in the Caesar's Gallic Wars texts where is does not have much demonstrative force, and so we've translated it as the. Edem is really just is, ea, id with a dem ending. Edem has a long I there. That's really isdem. It's isdem, but the S has dropped out. And so it goes from being isdem to edem, because after that S drops out, a linguistic phenomenon occurs known as compensatory lengthening. When you have a consonant drop out, the previous vowel sound can be lengthened to compensate for the loss of the consonant. So edem is really isdem, but with the S dropped out and the I lengthened due to compensatory lengthening. So edem really is just is, ea, id with a dem ending on it. It doesn't look like it because we've lost the S there, but it really is just id. And further proof of that is that in the neuter, the I is not long because the S did not drop out. So it's just idim with a short I. So in the neuter, it's just id, id, plus dem. I think the two Ds collapse down into just one D. But my point is that the I there is not long in the neuter because the other consonant sound of the S did not drop out. There was never an S there to drop out because it was always just id plus dim. So again, that is called compensatory lengthening. For those of you who study Greek, you'll see that much more as you attempt Greek because that exerts control over a lot of spelling changes in ancient Greek. Number 4, the intensive pronoun is ipse, ipsa, ipsum. And so, like many of these, this can function as an adjective or as a pronoun. You can say ipse ambulat ad oppidum. He himself is walking to the town. There it's functioning more as a pronoun. Or you could pair it up with a noun and say vir ipse, the man himself is walking to the town. You could say ipsa ambulat ad oppidum. She herself is walking to the town. In other words, she's not sending someone else on her behalf or just mailing a letter. She herself is walking to the town. Or you could pair it up with a noun and say mulier ipsa, the woman herself is walking to the town. So the intensive pronoun ipse, like many of these, can be either an adjective or a pronoun. It can function as both. Number 5 is the relative pronoun. We've studied that many times. It starts a relative clause. It agrees with its antecedent in number and gender, but it gets its case from the role it plays within the relative clause. So it's getting its morphology from two different places, both from its antecedent and from the clause that it lives in. Number 6, the interrogative pronoun. If you want to ask a question, who went to the town, you would say quis. Quis went to the town. So that's asking the question, who. Quis is masculine and feminine. It's the same morphology for both genders. But for neuter, it would be quid. So quis is more if you're asking about a person and therefore means who. Quid is more if you're asking about an inanimate object and therefore means more like what. So quis and quid mean who and what in the sense of asking a question. Therefore, they are the interrogative pronouns. And then in this lesson, number 7, we've studied indefinite pronouns like quisquam and especially aliquis. That's another big one to watch out for. Aliquis. And then after si, nisi, num, and ne, you'll see aliquis merely as quis without the ali at the beginning. So aliquis means somebody or anybody. Aliquid means something or anything because that's neuter. And then we have the rule, after si, nisi, num, and ne, all the allies fly away. That's a little mnemonic that can help you remember that after si, nisi, num, or ne, you'll just see the indefinite aliquis without the ali. So in texts, you'll see things like si quis, num quis, nisi quis, but it still has an indefinite flavor. Okay, let's move on now to section 512. That's our translation section for this lesson. Go ahead and do all these exercises except number 20. Turn off the recording, give them a try, and when you're finished, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework here in section 512. Let's go over them together, starting with number 1. Number 1 says, ego vos laudo. The verb here is laudo. That means I praise. It's first person singular. Laudo means I praise all by itself. It does not need the help of any pronoun to express the idea of I. Laudo includes the idea of I and the idea of praising, all in one word. So laudo means I praise on its own. However, here we have the additional pronoun ego, which means I. Having this optional pronoun here can add emphasis. It can serve rhetorical purposes. It can tell you right up front at the beginning of the sentence who is doing the action. It can draw a contrast, saying that it's not someone else, but I. So there are several reasons why you might want to include the optional pronoun ego here. The direct object is vos, which is accusative. That means y'all. So the sentence says, I am praising y'all, or I praise y'all. Even without the word ego, it would still translate the same. Even if it were just vos laudo, it would still be, I am praising y'all. But with ego here, it could be saying, I am praising y'all. Not that guy over there, not that lady over there, but I am praising y'all. So by having the pronoun ego there, it adds strength, clarity, emphasis. And as we've seen earlier in this lesson, in Roman comedy, when there's lots of dialogue, it can be just more of the normal parlance, the normal way of talking for the characters on stage. Because in actual speech, there's a heavier use of pronouns. We read that in our quote from L.R. Palmer in his book, The Latin Language. In fact, he has a whole chapter on that, chapter 4, and the quote I read from is on page 75 if you're interested. So number 1 says, I am praising y'all. Keep in mind that vos could be accusative or nominative, but here in context, we can tell that it's accusative. Number 2 is next. Nos te laudamus. The word laudamus is first person plural. It means we praise or we are praising. It means we are praising on its own. It does not need the help of any pronoun to communicate the idea of we are praising. However, we have the extra optional pronoun nos here as the subject. It's duplicating the idea of we. So nos here, actually nos could be nominative or accusative as far as its morphology, but it is in fact nominative here. It's doubling up the subject of laudamus, drawing emphasis, perhaps drawing a distinction. So it's saying we are praising. Not those people over there, but we are doing the praising. So it has perhaps an emphatic or clarifying aspect to it. The direct object is te, which means you in the singular. So number 2 says, we are praising you. The word te could be accusative or ablative, but in the context of this sentence, we can tell through the context that it's accusative. It's the direct object of laudamus. Number 3, vos eum laudatis. The verb here is laudatis. That's second person plural, present tense. It means y'all are praising or y'all praise. Laudatis means y'all praise all by itself. It does not need the help of any pronoun to communicate y'all praise. However, we have the extra optional pronoun vos here, which doubles up. It duplicates the subject, y'all, of the verb laudatis. So vos adds emphasis. Vos could be accusative or nominative, but here in this sentence, it's nominative. So vos means y'all, laudatis means y'all praise, or y'all are praising. And so by having this extra pronoun here, it adds emphasis, clarity. It can help with word order to show right up front at the beginning of the sentence who is doing the action before you get to the verb. We saw an example of that also in Palmer's book. And then eum is an accusative form of is ea id. It's masculine, so we'll translate it as him. So number 3 says, y'all are praising him. Number 4 is next. Tu eos laudas. The verb is laudas. That's second person singular. It means you praise, that is you singular. Laudas all by itself means you praise. It does not need help from any pronoun to say you praise. However, we have the extra optional pronoun tu here, which adds emphasis or clarity. It emphasizes that you are doing the praising. So tu here is nominative, and eos is accusative plural, masculine of the pronoun is id. And so number 4 says, you are praising them. Number 5 is next. Persuasitne tibi. Here we have a question that is being formulated with the special ne suffix. Persuasit is the verb. That's the verb persuadeo in the third person singular perfect tense. So persuasit says he, she, or it persuaded. And then if we add ne to the end of it, it turns it into a question. It's not expecting a yes or a no, it's merely just posing a question. So persuasitne asks the question, did he, she, or it persuade? And persuadeo takes the dative. So the person being talked about who is being persuaded gets put into the dative case. And so here, the person asking this question is saying, did he, she, or it persuade you? And so for you, for the word you, since persuadeo takes the dative, the speaker has to put the word for you in the dative case, which is tibi. So, persuasitne tibi is a question that says, did he, she, or it persuade you? Number 6 is next. Mihi persuadebant. Again, persuadebant is the verb persuadeo. It's imperfect tense, third person plural. We don't have an explicitly stated subject. So it just means they were persuading. Again, it takes the dative. Mihi is dative. So number 6 says, they were persuading me. Numbers 5 and 6 are giving you some good practice working with the dative forms of the personal pronouns. Number 7 is next. Dicit te ire secum. Here we have a classic case of indirect speech. It all starts out with a verb of saying, thinking, and that's dicit, which means he, she, or it says, or he, she, or it is saying. We do not have an explicitly stated subject for dicit. We don't know the identity of the person speaking. So we'll have to supply a pronoun. Again, dicit could mean he is saying, or he says, or it could mean she is saying, or she says. We just don't know. We would need more context to know more about it. So dicit says he or she says, and then we have indirect speech. We need a subject accusative, that's te, which is accusative, it means you. And then we need an infinitive to be the verb, and that's ire, which means to go. That's the infinitive form of eo. Dicit is present tense. Ire, the infinitive, gets its tense relative to the main verb. So ire is also present tense. So everything here is present tense. There's nothing happening in the indirect speech that goes outside of the present tense. So what we have so far would say, he is saying that you are going, or she says that you are going. And then secum is the reflexive pronoun se here in the ablative case, and it's got cum attached to it instead of cum se with himself or with herself. They get compounded together and it forms secum. So secum just means with him or with her in the sense of with himself or with herself. So number 7, if it's a guy or man speaking, it could say, he says that you are going with him. Or if it's a woman speaking, she says that you are going with her. It could say either one of those. We just really don't know. So it could be either one. Number 8 is next. None is mecum. Here we have a question that is starting out with the word none. When you start out a question with the word none, it's a signal that you want or expect the answer to be yes. It's really the word non with the ne ending. It means something like, isn't it? Or aren't you? Or something. When I see the word none, it reminds me of, in English, when we say, is it not? Is it not the case that blah, blah, blah? Because that's literally what it is. It's not plus a question ending. And is here is second person singular of the verb ao, which means go. So is means you are going, and mecum means with me. So here's why none reminds me of is it not in English, because you could translate it that way. You could say, is it not that you are going with me? So if you translate none like that, it makes perfect sense in English, because literally that is what it's saying. And so just as in English, if I say, is it not that you are going with me? That is archaic speech, but nevertheless, it does expect the answer to be yes. In more modern English, we would say, you are going with me, right? Or, you are going with me, aren't you? But just for fun, sometimes I'll say, is it not that you are going with me? And I say that in jest, but also to help you capture the idea of literally what none is doing there. Number 9 is next. Quis nostrum ire volt. Here we have a partitive genitive, that's nostrum, which is genitive plural. It means of us. The verb here is volt, which is third person singular of the verb volo. In later texts, it would be spelled vult, volt. And the subject is the interrogative pronoun quis. So quis and nostrum together say, who of us? And then again, ire means to go. So number 9 says, who of us wants to go? Again, nostrum is a partitive because quis is just one part of a larger group comprising the group that is us, or we. And so nostrum is a partitive genitive, or otherwise known as a genitive of the whole. Number 10 is next. Hi viri ire nolunt. Now here we have a good example of hic haec hoc being used not as a demonstrative pronoun, but as a demonstrative adjective. Why? Because it's paired up with a noun. It's not just he, which would be nominative plural, meaning these guys. Here, it's got an actual noun with it, viri, which means men. So these men, that's hi viri. And the verb is nolunt, which means to not want. It's third person plural, present tense. So these men do not want ire, to go. These men do not want to go. Again, he here is acting as a demonstrative adjective, not merely a demonstrative pronoun. So that's good practice for that. Number 11 is next. Pueri mihi vocandi sunt. Here we're having a blast from the past. That's a passive periphrastic saying that something must happen. The word vocandi is a future passive participle of the verb voco, which means to call or summon. So vocandi says to be called or to be summoned, and sunt means they are. So what we have so far would say the boys are to be called, or the boys are to be summoned. Then, oftentimes, with a passive periphrastic, you can have a dative of agent. Ordinarily, if you have passive activity occurring and you want to say by whom the passive activity is being done, you would have an ablative of agent with a or ab plus an ablative. But in a passive periphrastic kind of construction, you don't have that. If you want to show agent in the context of a passive periphrastic, you use the dative case. And so that's called a dative of agent. So here, mihi will mean something like by me. So here in number 11, we have a passive periphrastic saying that something must be done, and we have a dative of agent showing by whom that activity must be done. Literally, the boys are to be called by me, in the sense of the boys must be called by me. To render it into smoother English, we'll turn the verb from passive into active, and we'll say, I must call the boys. So to render it into smooth English, we will translate it with a non-literal translation. Number 12 is next. Si nobis persuadebit, bene erit. Here we have a future more vivid conditional. In any conditional, you'll have two parts, a protasis, some people pronounce it protasis, and then you'll have an apodosis. So the protasis is the first part that has the idea of if, and then the part that's the response to that has the idea of then, that's called the apodosis. So the protasis here is si nobis persuadebit. That's the verb persuadeo in the future tense, third person singular. So it has the idea of he, she, or it will persuade, and persuadeo takes the dative, so nobis means us. Si means if. So the protasis here is if he, she, or it will persuade us, and then the apodosis is bene erit. Erit is future tense, so it will be. Erit is sort of an impersonal, so it means something like it will be, and then bene means well. So literally, if he or she will persuade us, it will be well. Again, that's called a future more vivid conditional. In this book, they call it a future more probable. And you can review that back on page 186 if you like. Number 13 is next. Ipsi ad renum ibant. Here's a good example of the intensive pronoun ipse functioning as a pronoun. It's just standing by itself. It's not paired up with any kind of noun. So ipsi is nominative plural, so we have to figure out some way to render that into English by saying something like they themselves. We'll circle back to that in a minute. Ibant is the verb here. That's the verb eo, which means go, and it's imperfect tense. So ibant says they were going. Ad renum says to the Rhine. The Rhine River is a big river that runs largely north-south and is a historical border between France and Germany. Not to be confused with Rhodanus, which is the Rhone River. So for lack of a better translation, we could say something like, they themselves were going to the Rhine. The only subject we have really is ipsi. We know it's they because ibant is third person plural, so it's they doing the action. So we can just intensify the idea of they in our translation and say, they themselves were going to the Rhine. Number 14 is next. Ab ipsius castris. Here we have a prepositional phrase, ab and castris, with a genitive sandwiched between them. So ab means from. In the context of an ablative of agent, ab can mean by, saying that activity is being done by someone. But here it just means from, meaning movement through space, just from, a garden variety preposition. Castra means camp. That's a second declension neuter noun. Really, in the singular, it would be castrum, but castra is always plural. So castris is ablative plural, the object of the preposition ob. So ob plus castris will say from the camp. And then we have ipsius as a genitive. That's a form of ipse, the intensive pronoun. We just saw another one in exercise 13. We translate it by saying things like himself, herself, itself, themselves. It intensifies some kind of party, some kind of identity of some person or party doing something in the sentence. Keep in mind that ipse is a naughty 9 adjective. So in the genitive singular, we have ipsius, and in the dative singular, we have ipsi with a long I, IPSI. If this were just a regular garden variety first and second declension adjective, we would have genitive forms like ipsi, ipsi, ipsi. And then in the dative singular, we'd have ipso, to him, or ipsi, to her. But that's not how it works. Ipse, ipsa, ipsum is a naughty 9 declension. It declines just like a naughty 9 adjective. So that's why ipsius here is genitive. That's a naughty 9 genitive singular, and it means something like of him himself or of her herself. Could be masculine, could be feminine. Of course, in the Roman army, it was just men only, so since it's from a camp, it's probably talking about soldiers and therefore men. So we'll translate ob ipsius castris as from the camp of him himself. That's a clunky translation. It doesn't sound very good in English, but that is faithfully rendering what the Latin is saying. Number 15 is next. Caesar istem ducibus usus est, qui nuntii vinerant. We have two clauses here. We have a main clause and then a relative clause starting with qui. So let's tackle the main clause first. The subject is Caesar, and the verb is usus est. That's a form of the verb utor, which means to use. Utor is a deponent verb, and it's one of those deponent verbs that takes the ablative case. It's one of the puffy verbs. Potior, utor, fruor, fungor, vescor. Utor takes the ablative. That's why eistem and ducibus are both ablative. And so usus est is perfect tense. That means he used. This is a gendered verb because it contains a participle. The participle has to match the natural gender of the person doing the activity. Julius Caesar is male, so we get a masculine ending for usus. If it were a woman doing the action, if it were a woman named Aemilia, then it would be Aemilia usa est. You'd have a feminine participle. So that's a gendered verb. So here, Caesar usus est says Caesar used or Caesar employed, Caesar made use of, something like that. And then ducibus means leaders. That's in the ablative because, as I mentioned a moment ago, utor takes the ablative. So the idea is Caesar used the leaders. He made use of the leaders. He employed the leaders. We need some good way to translate that. And then eistem is a form of idem, which means the same. So eistem ducibus says the same leaders. So what we have so far would say Caesar used the same leaders. We need more context to figure out exactly what is going on here, because that sounds awkward. Let's read on. We have a relative clause here, qui nuntii vinerant. This relative clause is being started out by the relative pronoun qui. Qui is masculine and plural because ducibus, its antecedent, is masculine and plural. But it's nominative because of the role it plays in its relative clause. Vinerant is the verb vinio, which means come, and it's pluperfect, third person plural. So venerant says, they had come. So leaving out the word nuntii for right now, what we have so far would say, Caesar used the same leaders who had come. And then nuntii tells us the role in which those leaders came. The footnote says it's a predicate nominative. In English, we throw in the word as for this kind of word. So we'll say, who had come as messengers. A nuntius is someone who gives you a message. An announcer, a messenger. So Caesar used the same leaders who had come as messengers. So what does this mean? What it could mean is that dukibus is referring to something other than a military leader. One of the meanings in the dictionary for dux, ordinarily dux just simply means leader. It's related to the word duco, which means to lead. But one of the meanings for dux is guide or conductor. So from the context, we can tell that they came as messengers. So what could be happening here is that some guides, people who help guide you through territory, these guides got hired to be messengers. And then when they brought a message to Caesar, he said, hey, these guides are good guides. I'm going to use these same guides for my own purposes. I'll hire them to do stuff for me now that they're here. So let's translate dukibus as guides, and we can say Caesar used the same guides who had come as messengers. So someone uses guides to relay a message to Caesar. They come to Caesar, and he says, hey, you guys really know your way around. Maybe you can work for me and guide my soldiers around this unknown territory. So that could be what's happening. We'll translate it like that, for lack of a better translation. Number 16 is next. Priusquam Caesar quicam conaretur, duiciacum ad se vocari iubet. We have two clauses here. One is a temporal clause, starting with priusquam. The main clause is duiciacum to the end. So let's try that one first. The main verb here is iubeo, iubere, from the second conjugation. So iubet says he, she, or it commands. And then we have an accusative plus infinitive construction to show what the person is commanding. Duiciacum is accusative, that's a person's name. Vocari is the verb voco, which means to call or summon. It's a passive infinitive. Notice the long I. It's not an active infinitive, vocare. It's vocari, which is passive. So he, she, or it orders or commands duiciacus to be summoned. And then ad se means to him, to himself. We're talking about Julius Caesar here doing the commanding. We can see that his name there is in the first clause. So the idea is he commands duiciacus to be summoned to him. And then the first clause is temporal. Notice that we have a subjunctive verb in this temporal clause. Priusquam means before or beforehand. Conaretur is the verb conor, which means try. It's imperfect subjunctive. The subject is Caesar, and the direct object is one of our new indefinite pronouns for this lesson, quicquam, which is an accusative. We saw that in section 509. That's number 4, quisquam. And then in section 510, they tell us that in the accusative, quisquam becomes quiquam. The C changes to a D. And that's the word that we have here in exercise 16. So quiquam is accusative, and it means something or anything. So this temporal clause says something like, before Caesar tried something, or before Caesar tried anything, and then the rest of the sentence, he commands duiciacus to be summoned to him. Number 17 is next. Si quid volent revertintur. Here we have a great example of aliquid being rendered without the ALI at the front. Remember the mnemonic device that I shared with you before si, nisi, num, or ne, all the allies fly away. So quid here is aliquid, but because it's coming after the word si, the A, L, and I have gone away. So instead of si aliquid, it's just si quid. So in this exercise, read quid as an indefinite. Wolent, the verb here, is future tense. That's the verb wolo, which means want. So wolent says they will want. And so the first part here says, if they will want anything. Again, quid is indefinite. Really, this is a conditional. It's a future more vivid conditional. Revertentur, that's a deponent verb, revertor, which means to return. And we actually saw this exact thing in a recent lesson in the text of Caesar's Gallic Wars. So it's an if-then statement, a conditional. If they will want anything, they will return. Revertentur is a future tense deponent, third person plural. So when both verbs are future indicative like that, that's classified as a future more vivid. In this book, they call it a future more probable. If we were to say this same thing in English, we would not put the protasis in the future tense. We would not say, if they will want anything. We would just say, if they want anything, or if they should want anything. In English, that carries with it the idea that the thing hasn't happened yet. So it already has sort of a future-y kind of feeling to it. But in Latin, you put the protasis in the future. So if they will want anything, in the sense of if they want anything, they will return. Number 18 is next. Quidam ex militibus decimi legionis. This is not a complete sentence. It's just a fragment for practice. We're practicing here the word quidam, which means a certain person. Quidam is masculine, so that means a certain man. If it were feminine, quaedam, then it would be a certain woman. I suppose you could also have a neuter one that means a certain thing, quoddam. But anyway, here in number 18, quidam is qui, which is masculine, and it's singular. So it means a certain guy, a certain man. And then ex militibus says out of the soldiers. In English, we would say a certain one of the soldiers. And then decimi legionis is genitive singular. That means of the 10th legion. Legionis is genitive singular for the word legion, legio. And decimi is an adjective that means 10th. It's got a feminine genitive singular ending because legio, like many third declension nouns that end in io, is feminine grammatically. So number 18 says, a certain one or a certain man out of the soldiers of the 10th legion, or a certain one of the soldiers of the 10th legion. 19 is next. Quisque sibi frumentum domo extulit. We talked about this a few minutes ago. Quisque means each. That's the subject. And then extulit is the verb fero, which means to bear or carry. Fero, fere, tuli, latum are the four principal parts. And it's prefixed with the preposition ex. So ex plus fero means to bring out. In the present tense, it turns into f-fero. The X turns into an F, and you get E-F-F-E-R-O. But here in the perfect tense, the X stays in place, and you get extulit. That means he, she, or it brought out. Domo is ablative of separation. It means from home. Frumentum is the direct object. That means grain. And then sibi is dative. That's a reflexive pronoun in the dative case. It means for himself or for herself. So number 19 says, each, in the sense of each person or each one, brought out grain from home for himself or for herself. The word sibi is not gendered, so we don't know the gender of the person doing the activity. It's just sort of a generalized statement, each person. So number 19 could say, each person brought out from home grain for himself or for herself. That's about the best I can do there. Let's skip over number 20. And so that brings us to the end of this lesson because unlike most of the lessons in this part of the book, this particular lesson does not have a reading from Caesar's Gallic Wars. So in this lesson, we're taking a break from the story of Vercingetorix and the Helvetii, but we'll pick up their story again when we come back again next time in lesson 66.